Good afternoon. We are going to go ahead and bring the November 6th Energy and Environment Committee meeting to order. Mr. Legislative Analyst, item number one.
Item number one. Item number one relates to motion Fuentes O'Farrell Labange relative request in Department of Water and Power and Board of Trustees of the Joint Training Institute and Joint Safety Institute to report as to the function, current status of these entities. Also, Mr. Chair, if you'd like, we consider number two. Number two relates to motion Fuentes O'Farrell relative to instructing the CAO to report on these matters as well as it pertains to the Joint Training Institute and Joint Safety Institute.
Very good. Yeah, we'll take up item number one and two. Number two, it was basically a revision of the same motion that we introduced, so we'll go ahead and take them concurrently. With that, I'd invite the CAO to the center table here to present on the report. And Mr. Nichols, if you'd like to come on up too, because I know that you've got a presentation as well, so may as well get comfortable up here. And so we'll start as a subcommittee because we don't have a quorum at this point. We do that here, subcommittees? Yeah, very good. All right. Sir.
Okay. This is a CAO report in response to the motion of October 1st.
If you could pull up the mic there so we can go ahead and make sure that we get it all for the record. Thank you.
It's been a while. Reporting on the motion from October 1st with regards to the Joint Safety Institute and the Joint Training Institute at the Department of Water and Power. The motion instructed the CAO to report back on the establishment of these two institutes, what their purpose is, what their governance structure is, what their funding is, and what their programmatic accomplishments are, and also their financial transactions over a period of time. The report you have before you responds to 5 of the 6 of those items. It does not report on the financial transactions of either institute at this time because an audit is currently in process and it makes more sense to wait for that audit. And once we have the audit, then the CAO would come back and report on the findings of that audit. So what you have is what I would call a very long report. And in some ways it may even appear slightly redundant. And the reason it appears slightly redundant is what we are reporting on is essentially 2 examples of exactly the same operational concept. And that operational concept is a program where management and labor partner together to address issues of common concern, in this case safety and training. So this type of solution is not unique to the Department of Water and Power. In fact, in the 70s, this became a very common tool that management was using in most of the industries in America where they were going through downsizing. And so joint labor management committees started in the private sector, pretty much migrated to the public sector in the late 80s. And in the city of Los Angeles, we have an example of that in the Joint Labor Management Benefits Committee and also in the Department of Public Works, where they have a pretty significant commitment to the joint labor management process, both in sanitation on their solid and on their water side. The concept, as I say, is not unique. The way in which this thing is structured, where management and labor have joint responsibility over the funds, is a common organizational structure in the private sector, primarily coming out of the Taft-Hartley Act and normally as it relates to the administration of benefits, primarily in the trades, where a set amount of money is set aside to a trust fund, and then the trust fund itself administers benefits primarily in the building trades. In the case of water and power, they were coming off deregulation in 1996, that act. In response to that, the department downsized pretty significantly in 98. And in 2000, we were seeing pretty significant spikes in workers' compensation. And in the year 1999, David Freeman, as general manager at that time, proposed this Joint Safety Institute. It was adopted by the board, subsequently adopted by the city council, and incorporated into the memorandum of understanding with the IBEW. It is modeled after the program that Boeing put in place with its International Association of Machinists. And it is exactly what you see in the case of Water and Power, where money comes out of the contract and is sent to the institute, and it is established as a trust. Because these are two of the same, I think the easiest way for me to go forward at this point is say how they're the same and then go to the way they're different. And so in both cases, and just one more introductory thought, JSI was put in place in the year 2000. The Joint Training Institute followed 2 years later. And so what you see is kind of a proof of concept, and it seemed to work for them. And so then it was expanded into the training area. So in this case, both of them are trust funds, and money is set aside from the department. And initially for the Joint Safety Institute, it was $1.2 million. And for the Joint Training Institute, it was $2 million per year. Subsequently, funding mechanisms were established so that it comes out as 10 cents per hour for IBEW employees for the safety side and 15 cents per hour on the training side. Both of these have a board. The boards are comprised of management and labor. And at the current time, there are 4 management votes and 4 labor votes. In order to conduct business at either of these institutes, it requires consensus voting. And it's an interesting consensus voting solution, because what it says is that management has 1 vote and labor has 1 vote, but they have 4 members on the committee possibly. So if management decides it doesn't agree with itself at any given point in time, then the general manager of Water and Power casts the vote for management. If labor doesn't agree internally, then the business manager for IBEW casts the vote for labor. In the event they do not agree, management and labor, then that action does not move forward. There is a process for dispute resolution in the event that the parties do not agree, and that process is not contained in the collective bargaining agreement. It is contained specifically within the trust fund agreements, and there is valid employer relations reasons for that, because you do not want to create in the collective bargaining agreement a dispute resolution system over an interest that they may have in the future. You only do collective bargaining and arbitration over rights that the employees have at the moment. And JSI and JTI look forward into creating additional new. And so if you're going to arbitrate under a collective bargaining agreement, you only arbitrate what exists, not what's coming in the future. The process for the dispute resolution is similar in both cases. They say a neutral can decide the dispute, and if they can't decide on a neutral jointly, then they select a person from the Superior Court. What is most important about both institutes is that they are advisory. They are not controlling in either area, either in safety or in training. The department management is responsible for regulatory compliance on all safety matters, and the department is responsible ultimately for training its staff. These 2 institutes serve in an advisory capacity and collectively bring both management and labor's point of view to ideas that are then potentially implemented within the institute and then spun off back to the department or run by the institute themselves. Both agreements are pretty clear with regards to minutes are kept, and the minutes and the actions of both institutes are available to the parties. So in this case, any action that's taken by the JSI or the JTI would be available to the Board of Water and Power Commissioners. All they have to do is ask. The agreements also say that funds that go into the trust stay in the trust. So whether the Institute spends the money that is given to them every year or not is one issue, but that does not mean the department has the option of not sending money the following year. So every year, the department accumulates the number of hours that the employees work pursuant to the formula, and they make a payment to the trust fund. The trust fund then expends that money pursuant to its obligations in fulfilling the agreements of the trust. There is one opportunity to amend the agreement, and that's specifically called for within the trust fund agreement itself, that the agreement can be amended by the parties, but it cannot amend the agreement such that it undoes the purpose of the trust. In terms of ways they are different, at this point the basic difference is the funding level, and there is one unique thing about the JTI rules, which is that, and I just found it curious, that there's a section in the agreement that says if there are an unequal number of members at the meeting, then no action can take place. But there's also a secondary section that says a vacancy does not preclude the committee from making progress. So those two are slightly at odds and probably should be looked at for a future amendment. In terms of programmatic accomplishments, the Joint Safety Institute has played a role in reducing accidents, as indicates in the report. When this institute was put in place, they had accidents at the rate of 8 claims per 100 employees. Back in the year 2000, that rate is now down to 5.1 claims per 100 employees. Is that solely the doing of the JSI? I doubt it. That has a lot to do with the fact that JSI is advisory and the department is responsible for its overall safety program, and the department is not standing by doing nothing. It is actively working on its safety program, and so those claims have come down. The value of a reduction in claims is pretty significant, because at the Department of Water and Power, their average claim costs a little over $6,000. And when you apply this reduction, it results in about a $1.5 million reduction if the rate had stayed the same. If you applied the 8.1 to today's workforce, we would be spending $1.5 million more than we're currently spending on safety. And since they're spending roughly $18 million on safety, or on workers' comp, not on safety, but on workers' comp, a $1.5 million reduction is a very good thing. Other issues they've brought forth have been specific to the operation of the utility, and in terms of creating value, those types of things, such as arc flash rated clothing to allow the workers to work safely around energized circuits. That's good stuff compared to the way it was before, which was they showed up in whatever attire they showed up in. So that was good. They've also done good work in the area of the way in which you can utilize certain equipment under power poles, and that has been sustained, which allows the department to work more effectively in responding to outages. So in terms of accomplishments, they are doing things. I mean, I think that's clear. And they are contributing to the corporate safety program that the department is responsible for. Safety is a little easier to quantify because you can simply just do the accidents. You know, if accidents come down, you're doing well. If they're not coming down, you're not doing well. But training, on the other hand, is a little more difficult to quantify. And so when we look at the programmatic accomplishments for training, you know, have they done anything? And that answer is yes. That's included in attachment 7 on the report of all of the programs that they've been involved in. You can look through that list of accomplishments and programs that they're working on, and there isn't anything in there that's not directly on point with operating the utility. So in terms of are they spending their money on things that are related to the mission of the utility, they absolutely are. In terms of a conclusion, if you will, to what we see based upon the areas that we've looked at, the conclusions are exactly what I've laid out, which is these two institutes, they don't operate independently. They're not out there on their own. They're not totally out of control or running amok. They are part of and part of an integrated solution around safety and training. And that's consistent with the fact that management represents 50% of the controlling interest in the institutes. So they are integrated well. Does management have the flexibility to bring issues to the table? They absolutely do. Are they guaranteed to get a vote on them? Not necessarily. But if it's of sufficient nature that it's critical to management to run a program through JTI or JSI and they're not getting union support, a dispute resolution system exists where they have the opportunity to make their case. With regards to transparency, minutes are available. Either side can request an audit of the funds, and in fact the audit has been requested by IBEW, so the financial records are available. So in terms of are there tools in place to allow these two institutes to be viewed on a routine basis, those exist. And that's it. So our recommendation is receive and file this section of the report, and we will report back on the financial piece once the audit comes in.
Very good. Colleagues, the general manager is also here to make a presentation, and I know that the Ratepayer Advocate also has some reports to make. So I have questions for the CAO, but I'm wondering from you all if it's, should we continue with the presentations and sort of come back to questions? Is that?
It makes sense to hear it all first.
Okay, very good. Mr. Nichols, would you like to make your presentation?
Yes, I will, Mr. Chair and committee members, council members. I thank you. What I want to do is just take a few minutes to put in context the programs and the focus and the function of the JTI, JSI relative to the other training, the much larger training that the department undertakes itself, because I think that context is important and I think instructive. Obviously, running the nation's largest municipal power utility and the second largest water utility of any ownership type is safety is critical. Training is critical. And there are a number of things that drive what our training requirements and levels are. Obviously, safety is when you're dealing with high voltage, when you're dealing with pressurized water, when you're dealing with 24/7 circumstances, it's incredibly important. That would be a major issue if everything was just static, and nothing is static about what Department of Water and Power is dealing with right now. We're going under phenomenal change. Get a little bit more of that in a moment. The other thing that's driving that is we have an aging workforce. That's not unusual for any utility. We are all going through that. It just happens to be an age issue across the world. Leveraging that knowledge and capturing that knowledge before that knowledge walks out the door in retirement is another piece of the training, and you're going to see an uptick on our costs as a result of part of that. So all in, those are some of the key drivers that we have. When you look on the right-hand side here, things that are underway, and we've spoken about this before the committee, before full council, clearly before our board, but there are just many things that we're changing on both the water and the power side. From a regulatory perspective, many things we're doing, not only what we have to do, but how we have to do it and how we have to report on it requires a lot of training. We were ramping up to 33% renewable. We're at 20% now. That's a whole different set of resources that we're developing, we're planning, we're financing, in many cases now we're even operating and integrating those into our system. Whole new set of training requirements to do that, things that we just never did before. We're eliminating coal and backing down out of that and dealing with that change. We have phenomenal aging infrastructure that we, frankly, have been under budgeting for a long, long time. Trying to ramp back up and get that done while you're doing everything else is a major effort with all kinds of different years of and vintages of equipment across the power and the water system. Again, a lot of that tied back into that first piece of an aging set of managers and field staff that are walking out the door with that. On the water side, we're dealing with a lot of constant changes of imported water, issues we're dealing with up in Owens Valley and the Owens Lake issues on there. Our whole requirements to try to replace that with groundwater cleanup, more water conservation than has been done before, better water conservation than most utilities across the nation are doing, recycled water, dealing with trying to get more efficiency out of our existing system, just a lot of things that we're learning to do and trying to transfer what knowledge we do already have to those who are coming behind as we change over that workforce. Our customer service effort, we had, I know a few of you have heard about some of the issues with respect to our recent changeover to our customer service effort. We replaced a 40-year-old customer information system with a brand new system that's a phenomenal amount of training associated with that. We're dealing with a whole set of kind of last century skills that we still need to keep. I mean, we still have, for example, we have blacksmiths. We have, have a blacksmith person on here. Well, why would we do that? Well, there are things that are so old, you can't get parts. We actually have to make them out of iron. That's a little bit different than everything that's the high-tech things that we need to do. We have to do both at the same time. So all of this just puts an incredible amount of effort on training. So I want to put that in context. So this is both the tall line that you see up there, the bluish purple color, is our annual training costs. Vast majority of that's labor, our labor, because we're spending time of our labor to do that. And then some outside costs we do, and some facilities, some things such as training materials and computerized systems and things like that. But it's primarily just the time and effort of our people to learn it and to train our people to train them, and then to bring in outside trainers where we don't have the training capability. And you can see how that's been ramping up. It ramped down in part those years. Frankly, I'll take responsibility for that. When I came in, I cut $500 million out of our cost in the first 90 days I was here. Part of that was training. We cut out a bunch of training. And now we've got to, find out there's actually pretty substantial need for that training. And that's the big piece. That little piece down there is JTI, JSI. It's important to put this in context. We are spending about $115 million a year in training our employees between our labor costs and those other costs that I mentioned. We're spending around $4 million a year in the collaboration effort between these two trusts, between management and labor, to identify where are their training needs, empirically identified by the people that are out there in the field that report that back up through labor, what management sees in the field in terms of issues that they see, we see that we need, bring that together, determine what do we need to do, how do we reprioritize if we need to, that big bar of costs out there. So we're spending about 3.5% through the JTI, JSI to help collaboratively agree upon in a management labor method with respect to where those training priorities should be, try to update that and deal with that both on safety issues, which are paramount and have had some of these benefits that Tom referred to, and just the fundamental training for the old guys, new tricks sort of issues that we're dealing with this phenomenal change that we're seeing in the change of our system. So I feel confident that the dollars that we're spending towards that are dollars that are towards the effort and are in a collaborative method that makes sense with for both the union and for management. So, well, how does that look compared to others? So you don't get a lot of good data on this. We aren't members of the Edison Electric Institute, so I can't get investor-owned utility information for you. And frankly, we're probably a little more like them than others because we're bigger. We're the largest municipal utility, but from the American Public Power Association has information. They give it to you blind. We know our data. We don't know the others. And what this shows is what is the percent of the top, 18 basically. I shouldn't say the top, but 18 utilities that have agreed to put information into a blind survey of costs. Now, I tell you, I think we've got some apples and oranges in here, because I think generally speaking, what we have in here, and I think all of the higher bar ones clearly include the labor costs. I think some of the utilities simply report, well, they may or may not have codes that capture all their training costs, and I think some of these are for just simply external costs out there. So you can see a kind of a significant difference that goes between about 2% to about 7% or so of total labor and benefit costs that goes to training. We're within that. We're on the higher end. There's some that are higher than us. I'd like to point out something with regard to that. We are the most complex municipal utility, perhaps one of the most complex utilities, period, in the nation in terms of what we're dealing with. We have major DC transmission lines. We have out-of-state power plants. We have old coal-fired plants some of which we operate. We have very old gas-fired plants. We have state-of-the-art brand new gas-fired plants. We have UV, ultraviolet water treatment plants that we're bringing online. We do all kinds of different treatment. We're dealing with trying to keep a century-old set of pipes going. There's just a number of things that are very complex for LA that a lot of other utilities don't have. And like everybody else, we have an aging utility. We have 500 people a year that are walking out the door in retirement. And replacing that requires some training. We're within the norms and on our overall budgets, and again, going back to where I spoke before, the JTI piece of that is effectively an advisory piece that helps management and labor work together to get there. So that's the general role. There's more information that I'm on this last page that I'm not going to spend your valuable time here to go on, but identifies what the key training costs that we as an overall utility are doing. Here's the programs that we're doing, some of which that have direct input by JTI, and JSI, and some that don't. But there are a number, just by the virtual number on each of those lists. There's a lot of training, a lot of areas, a lot of topics that you need to do to keep 8,800 employees actively providing water and power to almost 4 million people. So with that, I just want to make sure you kind of have had a context of how the efforts and the role of JTI, JSI is, the level of effort and expenditure towards that compared to our overall training efforts to meet the requirements for the department.
Thank you, Mr. Nichols. Let's go ahead and ask the Ratepayer Advocate to come on up and offer some comments on the issue and the CAO report.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Camden Collins for the Office of Public Accountability. The final CAO report that I received this morning didn't have attachments, so subject to reviewing that. I had an opportunity this morning to read the report in its final form. And should you have any questions about that I can answer, I'd be happy to respond. We, to back away from the particular issue at the Office of Public Accountability, recognize that the rate case that is going to be coming before you is going to require both the board and the council to balance the rate pressure of mandates against the aging infrastructure. And central to that is the manpower and how the manpower is being managed. So upon hearing persistent concerns about these trusts in July, I went out to the Power Training Center and talked to the people actually doing the training at that facility. So one of the things I can add to what you've already heard is that that facility is very minimally adequate. It is by no means a lavish affair out there.
I'm sorry, it's
by no means a lavish operation. I would say it's minimally getting the job done on craft training. I talked to all the trainers and I asked them all about the trust. And then the next month, I started really issuing written questions to further explore the issue of the fiscal accountability, the scope of the costs, the interrelationship with the PRP program. All of this is foundational to a rate case. Ratepayer Advocate in a state case of this size would be engaging in a blistering 3 to 4 month process at least of a very exhaustive list of questions dealing with costs. But because the office is new and small and the department has not staffed up for a different kind of process than what they've typically done, we've tried to focus more narrowly on the core issues of the cases we see coming forward, which is, again, a balancing act between mandates and aging infrastructure. And central to that is the management of the labor. And so I definitely continue to inquire into the overall labor costs and training costs, and would remind you that since 2009, benchmarking some of these operations has been the recommendation to the city so that we can get a handle on exactly what are the percentage and not have to try and guess with blind surveys, whether we've got an apples to apples comparison, because I think it would be helpful for everyone to know that if our costs are exceeding some norm, that we have an adequate confidence that that's for good cause.
Very good, thank you. If it's okay, I'll ask all three of you to stay up there because I think various pieces of the conversation probably affect you all differently. And I will say that, I'm very happy that the Ratepayer Advocate is involved in this process because in many ways I think it's, I don't want to say second set of eyes, but it adds additional scrutiny to the process because ultimately I think the concern that we all have is what does this mean for the ratepayer? And, in sort of hearing Tom's presentation about how the city of Los Angeles and the utility have prioritized training and safety memorialized in previous ordinances and MOUs, part of me is very excited about that because our utility is so unique and we have to, I think, be as innovative and as quick as possible to respond to the changing sort of work environment and to, I think, understand that management and labor have figured out a mechanism by which they can not have to go to a meet and confer process, but consent time, but actually be able to work in real time to try to address training and safety. That on its surface seems like a very good deal to all of us and to the ratepayer. But we're here because there was a lot of reports and speculation as to sort of what it is that these trusts are, and I think we are quickly finding out sort of what they're not. But to just sort of try to understand better, I'm going to ask that you all sort of help me understand a little bit by zooming out a little bit, and forgive me for sort of referring to sort of observers' sort of perception as to what this is, but it was largely reported that these were nonprofits. And I, in my first motion, even memorialized that to come and report on these nonprofits helped me understand sort of the structure of these things. We refer to them as trusts, or you have now in your report. What is the difference between a trust and a nonprofit as it relates to JTI and JSI?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm aware that these particular trusts are not established. If this were the private sector, this type of trust would be established under Taft-Hartley. But it's not. And so these particular trusts are actually established under probate law. So it's a trust. And in terms of their reporting obligation, they're reporting as if they were nonprofit, but
so when you say
distinction between the two.
So for reporting purposes, they report as nonprofits in terms of audits and that sort of thing, but in terms of their operation, you mentioned trusts. There is nothing that prevents the management of the city to sort of talk to its representative on these trusts to understand in real time what it is that the trust activities are. It's not as if and forgive me for sort of mixing the analogies here, but there's been a lot of concern in politics, especially around campaigns, that nonprofits don't have the disclosures that that other agencies do. And I think the hair on people's back sort of stands up a little bit when we talk about these as nonprofits. But I guess what I would like to understand is, are the mechanisms built into this thing for us as managers, whether it's the mayor or the city council, to understand what activities are taking place and expenditures are taking place in both the JTI and JSI?
I think the trust fund documents themselves are sufficiently clear on the issue of what's available. What's available is the minutes and the actions of the trust, and it's available to the parties. So it's available to IBEW, and it's available to management of the department. So that would be Mr. Nichols. He sits on the committee anyway, so obviously he knows what took place, because nothing takes place if he doesn't vote for it. And he has a board that he reports to, and they can ask those questions, and he is fully empowered under the trust to report what happened at those meetings. There was a concern, and I think this may go to the genesis of your question, which is back in 2005, this issue came up once before, and it came up around the issue of, are these meetings subject to the Brown Act? Because from the full transparency perspective, that's kind of our standard in local government and state government, which is, if you're subject to the Brown Act, then you have an agenda, you publicize the meeting, everybody knows when it is, all of the obligations of the Brown Act. There is an Attorney General opinion that says it's not. But does that preclude the management from reporting on the activities of the trust? Absolutely not. It just, there's an Attorney General opinion that says it's not subject to the Brown Act. So they could go do things, but you have a trust fund agreement that says all of the actions are reportable to the parties. And so the parties can report. So even if they go off in secret and do something, he still has an obligation to go back and report on it if anybody asks.
And report to the commission, it's the mayor and the council. I mean, it's not as if our representatives on the management side of things can act in a vacuum.
That's correct.
Okay. And I guess another thing that I sort of have heard an awful lot about is, and sort of zooming back into, or zooming out rather, to understand sort of the funding of this. A lot of concern has been made about sort of the amount of money that is being dedicated to the trust. How does the budgeting work for JTI and JSI? So how much of it is sort of contributed by the residents or the ratepayers, and how do they sort of set up their budgets? Understanding that a big part of sort of what we want to understand, i.e. the expenditures, is pending and there's a audit in the works, but how does the money get allocated? You mentioned a couple of figures as a result of sort of the MOUs. What is that? How much is it? How often? And how do they establish their internal budgeting for the money for training and safety?
Okay. When the JSI was created, the initial council action was that it gave the JSI $1.2 million for the fiscal year. And then subsequently, the MOU was amended to provide 10 cents per hour per IBEW employee that would be contributed to the trust. So the way I understand it works is that they run a summary of hours worked by IBEW employees starting on July 1st. Run it for the full fiscal year. On June 30th, they know that IBEW employees worked 100,000 hours or whatever it is, and multiply it times 10 cents, and then they make a payment to the trust fund of that resulting amount. So they don't do it prospectively because they don't know how many hours IBEW workers are working. They do it retrospectively, so you run the full fiscal year and then they make the payment. Once the payment is made to the trust, it belongs to the trust, and no money comes out of the trust unless the trustees act. For JSI, similar, except they started with $2 million and then created a 15 cents per hour per employee, and then they do that retrospectively again. So they know exactly how many hours they work, they make the payment pursuant to that exact number of hours, and that's the amount of money that goes into the trust.
So that's the money that gets deposited into the trust. How does the trust then budget for, because to me, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here, it seems to me that probably no 2 years are alike, depending on sort of what your levels of employment are and attrition and this sort of thing. So some years maybe there's a sort of new great way to do activities X, Y, Z, and it requires, some additional training and safety issues. And so I see these sort of as incubators for that type of technique. Understanding that the full responsibility of training and safety belong to management, how does then the trust understand how much to dedicate of that sort of revenue that they receive from, or deposit that they receive from the ratepayers? How do they sort of schedule that money, and how does it get spent?
The trust has two obligations. One, they are also on the hook for reimbursing the department for staff costs. So that's one component of their cost structure. So
whatever staff is employed by the trust, the monies that were deposited into the trust, then they reimburse the utility for the salaries of those employees?
That's correct.
Okay.
And they do that on a quarterly basis. So in the case of both trusts, there is a management administrator, there is a labor administrator, there is a clerk typist, and then they share between JTI and JSI one management analyst. So 3.5 people per trust, and those people are all on the department's payroll. They get paid by the department, but every quarter they submit a bill to the JTI or JSI, and JSI pays back the department for those staff costs. That's the first component of their costs. So they have a fair amount of overhead that is assigned to be paid for. Now, that overhead could be part of the department's overhead as well, and would be if these things didn't exist in all probability. But in terms of their small amount of money, going back to Mr. Nichols' slide on overall training versus JTI training, their admin costs consume some portion of that $1.2 million or $2 million. Then they have whatever they run programmatically. And so every year, they have a very good idea what their labor costs are going to be, because these people have been assigned, they've been assigned there for some period of time, so they know what's coming out. They know what their fixed cost is. Then they have what's left is their discretionary cost to apply to training. And they know what their reserve is, if they have any, if they didn't spend all of the previous year's allotment. And we'll know more about the reserves once we get the audit. So, and Mr. Nichols is probably in a much better position to address this question than I am in terms of what process they go through once they figure out $200,000 went to pay for staff costs. Now I have $1 million left over. What am I going to do?
Sure. And I guess the important part for us to remember here is that we are co-collaborators in whatever it is that the trusts are going to do. So, and there has to be unanimity in order to sort of agree for whatever expenditures in training or incubating ideas. Otherwise, they don't happen. And I think you mentioned that there's never been an occurrence where they disagree, rather, that they've never had to go to dispute resolution to sort of push through an idea, whether it's the labor side or the management side?
That's my understanding.
Okay. And so...
and I will tell you that understanding is based on discussions with the employee organization, and the reason for that is that's the only continuity member we have on this issue. In terms of the management side, is it 5 or 7
General
managers that we've had since 2000?
Oh, we've had 8.
Hey.
Counting me.
So, my point,
But who's counting?
yeah, my point being that continuity does not reside on the management side of the table on this issue.
But irrespective of sort of, with all due respect to the previous general managers and the current one, the general manager ultimately is the one that instructs our representatives, at least on the management side of the trust, and gives them instruction. And presumably also hears the reports back from the trustees that we assign to this 50% sort of collaboration. Is that right?
Not only hears reports back, but also sits as the chair or the secretary of each committee.
Okay. I'm purposefully asking you all of these questions because the CAO, is to sort of see over all of it. And at some point, Mr. Nichols will have some questions for you. So I guess just to come back to the reports about these nonprofits and sort of the acknowledgement that all of a sudden money is being spent, we are, the city of Los Angeles is fully present in all of these conversations in these trusts in terms of instruction and reports back, and ultimately in the sort of authorization of expenditures. And if we didn't agree with any of those practices or approvals, then they wouldn't happen because the nature of the trust necessitate unanimity in the performance of the function of the trust. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. So I will let my colleagues ask some questions if they have some, but because I've got so many more. Mr. Koretz.
Yeah, I've got a few. One is, I think when the public first heard about this, DWP setting aside money for nonprofits, I think some of the reaction was far off from what seems to be the reality here, which is, there are labor unions, they have nonprofits, sometimes they've set aside money for very fluffy purposes, sometimes they've misused the money. Just for the record, do we think we're getting full value for this? Is this all going to training and safety and the purposes that ostensibly we set this up for?
Based on the consensus voting, if management didn't think these were appropriate expenditures, they would have had an obligation not to approve them, and therefore no expenditure would take place. So, yes.
So we're assuming for the public that they know this isn't just a boondoggle where we're setting aside some money to be wasted. It's actually
Absolutely not.
for some very productive purposes.
No, this is an example of management and labor coming together, identifying a relatively small source of money to address an issue of common concern. And that issue of common concern is safety, and that issue of common concern is training the workforce to respond to the challenges of the utility.
Now, what I'm not totally clear on is why did we need to go through this process in the first place? Why wouldn't we simply set aside money for safety, set aside money for training, talk to our labor partners for input, and just do it? Was there any, what among this would have had enough controversy that it had to be a labor management joint effort?
I guess in terms of the history of this, it happens in 1999. It's coming off a period where they had significantly downsized the workforce. Workers' compensation costs were pretty high, and 8.1 claims per 100 is, when you look at the rest of the years, relatively high. And so how do you effectively get change in your organization on the issue of safety? And having worked in safety for a number of years, I contend that management can tell you to be safe all day long, and it will not change your behavior necessarily. When labor engages with management on the issue of safety, and your coworkers tell you that you're being unsafe, it tends to work better. And so, do you have to structure it the way they did? Absolutely not. But is there the opportunity done correctly to get a better outcome? I think there is.
So it sounds like the primary purpose was to get buy-in on the safety changes and training changes that needed to be made.
Yes.
And I assume you have enough background institutional knowledge of this. Do you have a sense that it worked?
I think on the safety side, if you drive claims down from 8.1 per 100 to 5.1 per 100, I think you declare victory there, frankly. On the issue of training, yeah, I guess I always have trouble with training, frankly, because it's one of those very subjects which is very difficult to put a metric to. But if the metric is, do the lights come on? And does the water run? Then the answer is this training must be working at some level well enough to ensure reliability, which, as far as I understand it, I don't happen to live in the city of Los Angeles, but is very, very good.
Now, I know there were reports that were mentioned. Who's been getting the reports from these two bodies?
And that I think is perhaps one of the areas where the reports are available to be had if anyone asks.
Or knew about them?
Or knew that there was an obligation pursuant to the trust to report back. And I can give you an example that's on the Joint Labor Management Benefits Committee, which I served on for years, and it has an obligation pursuant to the ordinance that put it in place that says every year the Joint Labor Management Committee is going to report to the City Council on what it did. Well, we put that thing in place in '89. I think we reported in 1990 and maybe in '91, and then we didn't report again until 2010. So the fact that there is a reporting requirement hardwired into an ordinance that we've adopted, it exists, but in the case of the Department of Water and Power, if you're going to roll through 8 sets of managers, the chance of having continuity of that reporting, probably pretty thin.
So anybody on the council ever see these reports to the best of your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
Now, anyone have an idea of what an audit review will consist of? How much specificity and what we're actually going to look at?
I did not.
And how completely we're going to try to fulfill the controller's request?
I think I'd have to report back on that. I glanced at the audit engagement letter. It doesn't provide me a ton of information. I think we're going to have to find out more once we get the audit, and then if we need to, either side can direct the auditor to go do more.
Do we know if other utilities have similar programs to this? Edison or Pasadena Water and Power or Burbank, other places?
There's a variety of training trusts across the nation. There's a national IBEW training trust. There's a local 11 IBEW trust down at the City of Commerce that I've contacted. There are a variety of training trusts that are governed by ERISA with respect to their fiduciary duties, but those are all like Boeing, where there's a private employer. There's a variety of joint action committees that are regulated by California that are not trusts, they're committees. I'm still looking for a trust that doesn't have as its mechanism a transaction between the employer and a specific apprentice. So those kinds of training trusts are very common, where the employer pays essentially a tuition for a 2-year program in addition to a cents per hour. And I would say that based on what I know so far, the cents per hour in these trusts is very moderate to the low side. But these trusts aren't involved in training apprentices, so they can't provide the metric on dollars per apprentice trained because that's not their purpose. So finding one that's like this is maybe not going to happen.
Do they have benchmarks? I mean, are they similar to what we're going to look at as benchmarks for this?
Well, that's why we started asking questions about the overall training budget and the labor that goes into it and how it's divided up and where it gets allocated and how it gets capitalized, because the only way to really get to good metrics for training is to back away from the dollars that are in the trust because they don't actually produce a product called an apprentice, and look at the overall training budget and start benchmarking the training operations and figuring out, where is this training money ending up in the organization? Is it in renewables? Is it in the PRP program?
And for the training, do we, are we teaching workers to find ways to improve the utility in the field, or are we focusing on ways to improve customer service? What do we do in terms of customer service training as part of this? Anybody have a sense?
If you'd like me to speak up, I'm happy to give some additional information on this. I think it might be instructive to go back, Mr. Chair, to one of the questions that you asked. Well, how does the budget get established? Not how are the dollars? Because Mr. Coltis explained quite accurately how the dollars are funded under the terms of the trust agreement. But we end up having there are periodic meetings of the trust. We have trust administrators and staff that provide support. They meet with the water system. They meet with the power system periodically. They're reviewing things such as accident reports, feedback from people in the field. And I want to make a quick point. We've talked, and understandably, Mr. Coltis has talked about our reductions in our accidents and the cost savings associated with that. We're also talking about human lives and human safety. So I would have to say that's first and foremost important in that regard. So we will go back and give you an example of something that we found. We found that we were repeatedly having some issues with respect to, and I can only report on the last 3 years because that's the only time I've been here, so I can't speak to what happened prior to that. But we had issues with respect to arc flashes, and this is a situation where we've got people working on live equipment, live high voltage equipment at various voltages, any voltage which can cause serious damage or death, and finding circumstances that they're encountering a flash, they get burns on their bodies, and we're finding an increasing number of this. So the JTI, JSI let's get our hands around what's the core problem here? What is the root cause of this? What's going wrong? So this evaluation brought some people in, laid out some suggestions for here's some of the things that we should be doing. One of the things was this greater focus that Tom mentioned of flame retardant clothing, so that if it does happen, it reduces the injury to the individual. That's just one example. We had a situation where we're finding we do have an aging workforce. We have an aging workforce that's in the field that's doing a lot of physical work. And we're finding a lot of twisted joints and problems with back problems and things of that nature. So, well, is there something about the ergonomics around the equipment they're using that's just wrong? I hearken back to short hose and short hose and such that were being used in the farm workers. Do we have a similar circumstance that we're having people use something the wrong way? So we brought in and did some ergonomic studies on something and funded some ergonomic studies on that. Another issue that we were looking at is as we're dealing with the matter of training for this 500 plus people that are leaving and all those other items that I pointed out that we're trying to learn new, and the fact that we're rebuilding power plants, we're rebuilding our substations and such. How can we train people better? And we've got a set of younger staff coming in here that think a whole bunch differently than the old graybeards that are going out the door. So we said, well, they think more in terms of, they look at video games. That's how they grew up. So can we do something that's more computer-based training? So JTI, JSI got together and said, what can we do? Who's out there that does this? Quickly turned around and identified, here's somebody that does that. Here's where they've done it elsewhere. Did some interviews on that, brought it together. That said, here's what we think we should do. Let's test drive that through the JTI. Agreed upon that, and then that's brought over into a DWP budget going forward. Those are just some examples of how we do this. So we come up on an annual basis, determine what are the key issues, what are we funding, where do we think we should put this. It's not like we're spending a whole bunch of time because it's a pretty tiny number out there, and we only meet periodically. But we meet with there. I meet typically monthly with two members, one member of the JTI and a JSI staff reporter on there to go through what are the things I'm hearing, or they tell me, here's the things I'm hearing from the field, from some of your people. What are your concerns about that? I'm sure Brian Darcy does the same thing on the union side. Then we come together at these meetings to determine what are those key issues. We have a running agenda that we tend to go through, and then we identify kind of research items, action items, and then once pass it over to DWP. So those are some of the examples, and we do that. We update that each year, and sometimes you can check off the box. Ergonomic training, we're kind of done for that for now. We started a whole new program that you might run into the department. You'll see these banners about Safe Start, and there is a whole safety industry around, basically, that's looking at the idea of getting into your fundamental behavior. What are the things that causes accidents? What are the things that causes you to do the wrong thing that results in an injury to yourself or to your fellow worker? And one of those is just fundamentally, stress issues, rushing, inattention, diversions, and things distractions. So there's a whole set of training around how can we stop that from being a source problem with no matter what we're doing. So there's a whole training program piloted initially through JTI, JSI. Now we're starting in a train the trainer program that's now becoming a DWP funded program going forward. And those are kind of typically the way we start prioritizing, identify opportunities, pass it to become a functioning activity of DWP.
Mr. Koretz, if it's okay, we'll go to Mr. Blumenfield, but before we do that, and then we'll come back for additional questions. Before we do that, I do want to recognize Boy Scout Troop 114. They are here today trying to and will earn their citizenship activity badge, and this is the final badge in the trip of badges required to earn their WEBLO, did I pronounce that properly? Rank. As part of the requirements, they must identify national and local leaders. There are plenty here, young men. Well, there's plenty young men here as well, and local leaders, boys, in order to become good citizens, and they're to identify who they know that is a good citizen and do something that makes them a good citizen. So I'm happy to introduce to the committee John Alvarez, who is my cousin. Wave, John. Ian Gutierrez, Sam Yoon, Nathan Quinones, Lucas Ibarra, and Jack Horvat. Give them a little round of applause. Very good. Thank you for joining us today. I think they ought to go through a rate-making case in order to earn a badge. Mr. Blumenfield.
I think it's appropriate we have Boy Scouts here today because always be prepared is part of the motto, and we're talking about safety and being prepared for safety problems and training, so it's very appropriate that you're here today. Of course, I like the idea that labor and management are getting together and coming up with solutions. That sounds wonderful. What I'm trying to understand also is the efficacy of this particular, the institutes. And you mentioned, I have a little problem with, you mentioned that, well, because we've gone from 8% to 1%, or, in these trainings, to say that that's proving efficacy. I mean, that's more, correlation versus causation. I'm sort of a stickler for those, and so I want to understand better how the institutes themselves are driving the reduction in accidents and everything else, rather than sort of, because you look at the big picture there, the blue line is clearly the driver, not the red line. Or it's that we have a great manager in Ron Nichols, and we have this, but the press was concerned with the institute, and I guess I want to understand if there's ways that the efficacy of the institute is measured. Are there metrics that are typically used for measuring the efficacy? I guess I'll start out with that question. I have some sort of related questions to that, and I guess I'll throw that open for anyone on the panel.
Let me speak to that. And I think consistent with what Mr. Colt has said, to go back and be able to say, was that drop from over 8 per 100 reportable workers' comp cases to about 5, the cause and was it a benefit specifically from the JSI and JTI? I don't think we know, nor one that I can't take any credit for that, by the way. It happened before my watch, that reduction. So I don't think you can actually go back one for one and take that, because one of the issues that you find is safety is a culture. And you don't change that culture overnight. It's something that's taken a lot of time, and we're still working on changing that culture. We have seen some recent upticks in some thankfully more moderate injuries that we've seen, and so we're going back to this once again. How do we make sure that we've got the culture right? What are we doing with respect to that? So I don't think you can get that in terms of being then say, well, let's take this and say what portion of this, what metrics drive this? It just simply isn't that. It's just not that precise. This is a kind of a Delphi approach, if you will, if you're familiar with it. You get a committee together. We meet periodically. Prior to these committee meetings, you have staff of both of the trusts speaking, certainly not on a statistically valid basis, to be honest, in terms of what are they observing, what are they hearing, what's the feedback you get from management, what's the feedback you get from the rank and file employees that are the ones that are trying to learn these things and trying to make sure that they're safe, and that their managers trying to make certain that they come home safe each night. It's observed experiences, and you come together, and then you get together to determine the course of time based on the information you get from the staff input to that, and sometimes some outside advisors that we bring in. What do we think is the most important? And so I can't sit and tell you there's really strong, hard metrics around that. It's more of the clear things that seem to be an obvious problem are the ones that we jump on first. I'd like to be funding a lot more than we're funding right here on training. On that blue on your blue on my screen, purple on yours line up there. I think we should be probably doing more given all these types of changes that we're going through right now. So we're hitting the high points on things that we know are anticipate are meaningful, but I don't think I can put a kind of stochastic analysis metrics to that.
So how do you decide the rate? I mean, you have a certain number of dollars, which is the red plus the blue.
Right.
How do you decide the ratio that it's 3.3% versus maybe it would be better for the institution if it were 7% and on the red, and or maybe 1%? I mean, how is that?
Well, number one, it's simply established in the trust agreements and in the memorandum of understanding, the labor agreement between IBW here, approved by past commissioners, approved by past council. So we're to change that right now. Literally, my understanding, I'm not a lawyer, but I understand we'd have to come back with a new ordinance. There'd have to be a new change approved by the city. There'd have to be probably some sort of meet and confer arrangement between management and labor to make those sorts of changes. But right now, we're just the dollars that come in there are fixed per this formula. The other question, probably more the question that I would expect from you, which I think you just gave me, is how do we determine the size of that big bar up there? And that's a function of just managing overall budgets. It's gone up because we've been cutting things a lot. I came in, as I said before, I first came in here, I cut budgets a lot, and training was one of them. Found that it wasn't the right thing to do, necessarily. We probably, if I had that decision to do over again, I probably would have cut a little bit less and kept more back in training. But we weren't getting rate adjustments, so we kind of needed to cut. So we're looking at things that are kind of empirically what we're seeing, areas where we're seeing, and we do take a look at what are other utilities doing. We go out to industry meetings with other utilities on new programs they're doing, things that they're doing, and we take a look at that and say, how do we measure up generally in terms of are we doing that kind of training or not?
You would do that as a manager, whether you had these institutes or not.
We would, and we would indeed. I think the fact that management and labor is using that small red piece to try to get concurrence on what are the new things that we do or what do we change about what we're already doing in a way that management and labor is together makes it more effective. And I think spending 3.3% of our budget to do that and doing that in a way that it's not a management cram down and it's not a labor asking for something that management may not agree with is frankly a more efficient, effective way to get it done. And going back to what Mr. Coulter said, when labor is supporting it and labor and management is both supporting it, it's kind of like go to mom, go to dad, right? When they both tend to agree, the kids tend to agree as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm not doubting that that's probably a very effective tool to do it. Just trying to understand better as all the attention around it, makes people scratch their head. What are the rules that govern this? I mean, are there limits on what can and can't be spent? I understand from what you're saying that almost half of the money goes to staff costs to basically to run the institute so that folks can better talk to each other, and then it sounds like the rest of it sort of goes to funding these studies like the ergometric study and the training study. Is that about right in terms of percentages?
No, it's not quite right. Councilmember, it's probably, I don't have numbers in front of me right now and the other issue is, this is from memory because I'm provided documents in hard copy and look at them and I don't come away with documents from these meetings. But generally more on the order of probably about 25 to 30% of the overall cost is in staff costs on that. And in addition to the studies that I indicated, there is some initial seed training, pilots of training that happens. And in a couple cases, there's software that's purchased. A couple times we've purchased some hardware to be able to have pilot something in the field for a new type of pad that provides information or gives somebody
But it would all be sort of narrow pilot type of
Very,
thing.
yes, correct.
Just given the numbers, there's no way you would be able to do something to scale with the budget within the Institute.
Absolutely correct.
So are there limitations or are there rules, and aside from the fact that you have to have agreement for management labor, which creates its own box, are there other limitations with regard to what you can and cannot spend the money on?
There are limitations with regards to self-serving, if you will. The trustees cannot utilize the money for their own purposes other than for reimbursement. So for example, if the trustees are sent to a training program,
Right.
then they can receive reimbursement from the trust for that. But they receive no salary as trustees. They can receive no other financial compensation from the trust. So there is that built into the trust agreements. The other limitation is that as trustees, they have a fiduciary obligation to spend the money pursuant to the purposes of the trust. And the purposes of the trust are very clearly laid out in that they're going to cooperatively deal with safety on the JSI, and they're going to cooperatively deal with training on the JTI. And so if they want to spend money on something that is not in those two core buckets, then that's a violation of their fiduciary responsibility. So in terms of limitations, those are the two limitations that exist within the agreement.
And if I could add, there's a practical limitation as well. Certainly I can speak in terms of what management side of the trust has done since I've been here, and that is we want to make certain that if we're spending these monies, is it something in that red bar that we within the utility are then going to deploy on if it's a pilot, are we willing and ready and able to go and take that action and make meaningful use out of that? So there's an automatic regulator and prioritization mechanism that says, well, we're not going to go do a pilot of something that we don't have the wherewithal, the time, or the skill sets, or the capabilities to then deploy. Or we're not going to go spend, I'm not going to sit and vote on doing something that doesn't meet a perceived training gap or void that we have, be it a knowledge training or a safety training related issue. And I'm sure the same matter applies to the union.
And last thing, and then I have other questions, but just to keep it going, is just to also help me and other folks understand the types of things that are doing. If you had examples of something that was a success at the Institute and something that was a failure, because I imagine, given the innovative nature of this, there should be a fair amount of both successes and failures if you're doing,
Well, and here lies in probably a bit of the problem of the revolving door of general managers at DWP. I've been here not quite 3 years. And I probably didn't have a JSI meeting for the first 60 days that I was here. So let's say it's 2 3/4 years of experience. The nature of training, when most, as I've described, most of the training efforts that we're talking about are either researching what training should be done or establishing pilots there are not an awful lot of, in the duration that I've been here, that I can speak to, of information where we've gone to the point, researched it, done a pilot, and now have a couple years of experience of deploying that pilot to see how it's done, frankly. So just the reality is, the whole nature of this is it does take these series of actions and times to get done. I would say, however, something that I think is an important thing that I don't believe we have talked about here is, while I'm pleased with what the department does on training, we're not particularly agile and quick. You know, to do a procurement process on something for a pilot or to go out and buy a new piece of software could take the department through our procurement processes to get something done on that. Could take a year. JTI, JSI, we can sit and look at it. Someone can go out there, they can pull some information together, we can get done, and we can move forward on a $75,000 piece of software and have it done, tested, and at least deciding whether we want to try to do a pilot in maybe 6 to 9 months period of time. So we're able to compact getting some of these things going forward, but it still takes a while to be able to come back and say, well, what's the result? To get that, you would have to be able to go and say, what's everything that's been done for the last decade and pull it through. I'll be honest with you, I don't have that by virtue of the changeover of managers. I don't have that information.
There's no list. I mean, it would be a useful thing both to tout the accomplishments and to better understand it, to have a list of sort of the studies that have been funded over the years and, the ones that have succeeded and failed. But such a list isn't easily accessible.
I don't have one, and to be frank with you, when I'm looking at a $4.3 billion a year utility operation and $120 million a year training, when I'm satisfied that we're getting, good information back and logical information back and the kind of feed in of ideas that I described earlier on there, that kind of meets my litmus test.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to be on your radar, but I would expect it to be on the radar of the two administrators, the clerk typist and the analyst, whose livelihood revolves around this, that they would keep track of it. But certainly not in your world. It's a very, very small piece. But in those 5 people's world, it should be paramount.
Well, and what I'm trying to explain to you is that information could well exist on that. I've never taken it upon myself to go and ask and dig into it because I'm confident in the things that have been presented to me, that they're good expenditures, the programs make sense, the items that we're doing during my tenure are fine, and given that it's such a small piece of the overall budget, even though $4 million sounds like an awful lot of money, and it is, and we need to be accountable for it, I just haven't gotten it. That information may well exist. I just simply don't have it, so I can't confer upon you the results of that.
Maybe something that through the chair that we could request as not direct from Mr. Nichols, but from the folks who administer the program, a list of that sort.
Sure.
Might I suggest
yes.
that if you're going to head in that direction, the day I was out at the Power Training Center, they were showing me a new software module that they had developed themselves right there without anybody's help at the trust, and they were very proud of it. And one of the problems of working in these organizations is that there's awful lot of punishments for missteps, but there aren't a lot of rewards for doing exceptional and beyond work. And I think it would be important to express some interest in the innovative inherent tendencies of the employees and the trainers themselves. The people who are doing the training are lifers who love this organization, want the next generation to have the right attitudes, and they're really investing a lot in making the incoming people have a positive experience. And I would hope that you could be equally interested in what they're doing to make the situation better for the next
and toward
ride.
that point, my interest in this is not punitive in as much as sort of, well, I want to be excited about what's going on and be able to tout it,
it's not just in the trust is my only. It's not just coming from the trust. The innovation in the training and safety is broad in the organization, and I think those people need equal encouragement.
And to that end, just for us to sort of mind our P's and Q's as it relates to process, nothing prevents the commission from asking for a report back from the general manager to report back on sort of how that red line is doing. And as a council and as a committee, we can certainly drill down on the blue line and sort of understand what it is that is sort of great about the utility as it relates to training and safety, which I think is terribly important. In a former life, I used to manage workers' compensation claims. And for better or for worse, it gives you a real perspective on how enterprises work or don't as it relates to safety and training, which makes me sort of wonder out loud, Ms. Collins, how we would attempt to benchmark sort of the efficacy of just, let's call it training and safety in general, forgetting that it's red or blue, because unlike sort of the Ratepayer Advocate at the PUC, they have the ability to sort of compare a bunch of different IOUs and sort of see best practices and maybe suggest, in their process, ways for different utilities to hopefully sort of be better. And we've seen, utilities, at least in my time when I chaired the Utilities and Commerce Committee in the legislature, terrible sort of safety mishaps and ultimately costing lives in some of the territories. Here, I wonder out loud how we would benchmark any of this, because this utility is very, very diverse in sort of its approach and how it manages resources. And I don't know that this is sort of the metrics part of me from business school. Bob wants to sort of say, I need metrics, I need to understand how sort of we rank with somebody else. But the organizational behavior side says, part of this is culture, is figuring out what is sort of bothering the workforce, what's bothering management, and sort of settling that. What things are creating efficiencies, which things are sort of making the workplace safety, and sometimes there really isn't any sort of way to prioritize or set a queue to the things that are addressed. And so I just wonder out loud, how would we benchmark the efficacy of training and safety in general? Because you don't really have, I think, a comparable enterprise to look to.
Well, I can tell you that the training in water is $10 million, and the joint services has a much longer list of diverse skills, and they're spending 17. So when power has a budget of 114, and 26 of it is spent at the training center on the craft, the next question is, let's look at where the other piece is and where it's being allocated, so that we can then evaluate what the benchmark should be, because it is very, specific to the trade involved, and it's not all trades. For example, if you wanted to know whether the utility should be planning to have demand resources programs fold into their smart meter pilot, you can't expect to send that public employee to a California conference. This is a specialized area. They go to a national conference. There are budgets for that kind of travel for private utilities, and it's easy to assess whether they're reasonable budgets on a per capita basis. So once we find out where all the money is allocated, we will be able to tell you what the benchmark should be.
And so just wondering, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I have to imagine no 2 years are alike in terms of sort of what's been addressed and what hasn't. And so
the blacksmith, I'm not going to be able to help you with.
What's that?
The blacksmith, I can tell you right now. I'm not going to know about how we judge blacksmith.
For better or for worse, when the audit comes back, there may be extensive travel for a conference, because I don't imagine that, and with all due respect to the labor component and the management, them sitting across from each other sort of saying, well, what do you think is going to work, is going to be sort of the best way to come to innovative sort of solutions to some of the challenges that they're facing out in their work sites. And so it's going to necessitate them, I hope, getting out and sort of collaborating with other parts of the sector and trying to understand, what works, what doesn't, and hopefully learning. And so, I can imagine that we're going to get years where you have folks doing a lot of travel, and other years when they're not doing any, or sort of getting out and about. And so when you look at sort of that just on a sheet of paper, whether you're the controller or this committee, it's sort of hard to stand in the shoes of the folks who are making the decision unless we sort of trust them that we needed to go and do those trips or that particular training. And so when I ask about benchmarking, how do we know? I mean, granted, if they're taking a trip to Tahiti, maybe that's probably not the best place for training, or maybe it's the best place for training. I don't know.
Well, there's two primary tools you have to rely on. One is the Office of the Ratepayer Advocate, one of the things I've asked to do is to take the Safe Start training module. I don't know how I could have a sense of the value of the program if I don't take the module myself. Because we can all imagine everybody clicking boxes, doing a safety exercise once every other year, and thousands of training events would be generated by that. But that's not exactly the intent. So the other way to do it is to recognize that the trusts facilitate communication in a manner in which employees don't need to fear retaliation. So it's supposed to be a vehicle for really gathering the knowledge from the field so that they can communicate effectively on where the trouble spots are. And that's one of the reasons I was out at the training center, is I was persistently getting information there was a problem about the trusts, and I wanted to see for myself what the trainers were experiencing at their facility and what the challenges are for them managing their budget. And I learned enough about it that day to know that I probably need to go back and go over their budget with them. But in answer to your question, there are a variety of sources of information that allow you to come up with a kind of a totality of the circumstances and assess its reasonableness in context.
Very good. So at some point, we're going to hear that the audit was complete. And again, from a process perspective, I don't believe that we've got the authority to take a look at the audit, only because the trust, I take that back. I imagine that we have the authority to look at the audit based on our role as manager of the utility or co-manager of the utility, with the mayor being sort of primarily and his commission responsible for it. Is it the CAO's opinion that we would be violating any sort of fiduciary or sort of run into any trust issues, legal issues as it relates to the trust, if the manager and his representatives were to come back and sort of report on what the findings of the audit are? I know that is sort of a little complicated, but I have to imagine that as management, we have the ability to say to our representatives, what is it that you have found out in this audit? And I ask that because I'm not sure that we should sort of race to have, 3, 4, or 5 different sort of reviews. We have somebody who represents us on that trust as a co-partner on it, and presumably has a responsibility to this council and this mayor to report back. Is that possible?
Well, you asked a legal question, and so I defer on the legal questions to the city attorney. It's kind of the wiser course of action for me, because what seems reasonable to me inevitably is not the case when we get to a court of law. That being said, I think the trust fund agreement's relatively clear. Information is available, and the management side or the union side can share that information. And so, can the general manager report back on the findings of the audit? I do not see why not. And I also don't see, going to the legal issue, how has he violated his fiduciary responsibility to the trust if he does disclose what's in the audit?
And I ask
the answer I come up with is there is no possible way that he hurts his fiduciary responsibility by disclosing the outcome of the audit.
Since the general manager actually happens to be sitting here, I can tell you it's my expectation that upon receipt of the audit that I would provide a reporting back of the findings of that. And if there's a legal problem with that, I guess someone's going to have to tell me there's a legal problem with that, because the practical matter of this is, to me, is the ratepayer money that goes towards this. It does go into a trust. I recognize that. And there are fiduciary responsibilities with respect to the trust in terms of making decisions on the expenditures and such, but I just think as a matter of practicality and appropriateness, I would report back what is learned from the audit. And if I'm informed elsewise by counsel, then I guess that situation might change, but my operating assumption right now is that.
Well, then we would agendize it in closed session. I mean, there has to be a way for us to, as our agent, to report back. And so I'm not overly concerned. What is the expectation in terms of sort of the time frame for the audit? I'll ask the trustee.
Yeah, I right now I haven't been given a time frame other than to know that it's probably sometime beyond November. And I put that in context of what what the department is accustomed to. When we have an audit done of the department, admittedly, a more complex beast than the JTI and JSI, there's typically a 6 to 8 week period of time of just getting information by the auditor coming in, and then and easily a month or so after that until sometime that a draft comes back, and then the draft gets reported to for our auditor for DWP. It comes back to me. Here's what I found. Here's the questions we got about that. Our CFO, Chief Financial Officer, has that same review, and then it can easily be a 4-month period of time for us. I would expect it not have to be that long for this.
As a matter of course, aren't there regularly scheduled audits because it's a trust the way it's set up?
There are annual audits, correct.
Annual audits, okay.
That's correct.
Very good. Mr. Kretz?
I don't think I have any further questions.
Mr. Blumenfield has left the room, so I can't imagine he has any more questions. Very good. Unless you all have anything to sort of finalize, we'll go ahead and, let's see here, receive and file the report, and ask the CAO to come on back after they've checked with the department and we have a conclusion to the audit so that we can figure out an opportunity to have a conversation and understand what the results of that audit were. This has been very, by the way, I want to thank you all for helping us understand this, because I think the reports gave an impression that these things were not done with the participation of the city leadership, and the city leadership indeed has been the ones that helped construct this and are currently partners in all of this. So it seems to me that if there are any questions about the activities or expenditures or the management of the trust, we have the ability to instruct our agent, or at least I should say the commission has the ability to instruct its agent to help find some additional information. So this has been very helpful to me. I really do appreciate your helping us understand. And Mr. Kretz, after my close, what would you like to add?
I would agree with that, except the city council has been out of the loop on this. So I think what was going on was somewhat akin to a tree falling in the forest for us, because this all was going on, but we didn't have any knowledge of it. And I think obviously a connection to us from here on in would be a valuable piece of it as well.
And to that end, Mr. Kretz, thank you for bringing this up. I was talking with staff. I haven't prepared it yet, but my thinking is that there ought to be a system in place. It's our obligation and responsibility to look back on our ordinances that we enact. But to be fair, with everything that we do, maybe there ought to be a natural sort of tickler to the system, so that if it's JLMB, if it's these trusts, or if it's any other sort of thing that we've created, that we automatically get a reminder somehow to ask for a report back. And I think we can do that in a motion. I haven't thought that through, but would love to collaborate with you to figure out how to have a system sort of notify us that, hey, 3 years have gone by, no one has requested a look on this thing, but I'll remind all of us that that's our charge. We're supposed to keep track of all of this. Very good. Thank you so much. That will be the order for 1 and 2.
Okay, so just to clarify, on item 2, then we'll receive and file the CAO's report, and additionally request them to CAO report back once the audit is complete. For item 1, will that just be approved the motion, or?
For item 1, I think we're going to receive and file. Let me just take a look here.
Mr. Chair, what you could also do is continue both matters, ask staff to report back when the audit findings are in.
Okay.
That way, you don't move forward unless you want to move forward a report to council this time, a preliminary report, or leave it here, whichever.
So why don't we do this? We'll go ahead and continue the item until the audits are done so we can take up the items. I mentioned that I wanted to, so that will be sort of my first verbal motion. The second would be to ask the CAO, when you report back, to give us a list of all of the co-managed trust funds. Actually, I'm going to hold off on that. I'm going to work with you, Mr. Kretz, on that because I need to sort of do my due diligence. We'll go ahead and just ask for a report. We'll hold the items, report back as soon as we hear back when the audit's done, and then we'll talk a little bit more about all of those co-managed trust funds in the city and try to figure out a system so that we're notified. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Legislative Analyst?
All right. Item number 3, Chair members, relates to a DWP report, CO report as well, relative to proposed optical fiber lease agreements with Quest Communications. We have staff from DWP and the CAO on this matter.
Good afternoon, Gene Gamachi, Assistant Director with ITS.
Ken Kinsey, Director of the Fiber Optic Enterprise.
Robert Roth, the CAO's office.
This is a. Go ahead.
So the CAO report recommends approval of this proposed optical fiber use lease agreement. It's a master agreement, and it comes along with an associated short-form indefeasible right of use agreement, also known as IRU lease agreement. This is with Quest Communications, also known as CenturyLink QCC. It's for exclusive use of segments of the DWP-owned optical fiber system. Quest has leased these segments since 2008, and they plan to continue leasing it for telecommunication purposes, including telephone, data, and video. Approval of this resolution will establish a new master agreement with a term of 10 years, expiring in July 2023. And it'll be along with the 1-year IRU agreements, which automatically renew for 10 years. The compensation to the Power Revenue Fund will be $177,576 per year, and that's based on service rates which are included in that related IRU agreement. Future price agreements could be negotiated periodically, and there will be no more than 5 years between negotiated periods. That is pursuant to Charter Section 607B. City attorneys approved this resolution and agreement, and we recommend approval.
Very good. Members, any questions for our panel?
Just,
Mr. Blumenfield.
the use of the fiber optics it's not the exclusive use, it's just using some portion of it, right?
Exclusive use of that portion, that segment.
Of that segment, but
There's many fibers
There's many
within.
fibers in that.
Oh,
segment.
yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
So the capacity and other things, it doesn't actually, we're nowhere near our capacity, so there's no cost benefit there. I mean, we're not acing anything out.
You are correct.
Okay, that's all.
Very good. Therefore, let's approve the recommendation for the lease agreement, and if there isn't any objection, that will move out of committee unanimously. Thank you. Item number 4.
Number 4, DWP and CAO report relative to proposed amendment number 2 to a contract with Supplies Distributors Incorporated to provide ink dye. Staff from CAO and DWP as well.
Hello, Robert Roth, CAO again. This report recommends approval of a second amendment to agreement with Supplies Distributors, Inc. for certified ink dye used in the specialized printers used for customer bills. The original agreement for this contract was executed in August 2011 under the General Manager's authority, which is limited. At the time, it limited the authority to $140,000 and a term of 1 year. Soon after that, a first amendment was approved by the DWP board, and it increased the expenditure authority to approximately $1.3 million and extended the term another year for a total of 2 years. Today, approval of this proposed agreement will increase this expenditure by $3.5 million for a cumulative total of $4,829,000, and it extends the term 5 years with 1-year renewal options, taking it from August 2013 to August 2018. This total term is actually consistent with the expected lifespan of these printers, which are expected to be replaced in 2018. So DWP states that it researched competitively bid opportunities for this particular print die, and only one alternative was identified. However, it was an uncertified source, and it would void out an existing maintenance agreement. As a result, to maintain the maintenance agreement and to continue the proper use of these printers, this is the only option.
So the die is, it's more of a sort of a functionality sort of purpose that we're trying to serve because of the contract and the type of devices that we have. It's not for security or a certain type of die because of security reasons or...
No.
No, it's just so the printers will work and not jam.
Absolutely,
essentially. Yeah,
right.
Okay. And so understanding that, are you with the department?
Yes.
So in 2018 or 17, when we're procuring new printers,
Either we will or we won't.
or we won't. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll keep this sort of challenge in mind, right? Because
Yes.
we're hostage to this particular printer, Rico, and I'm sure they're fantastic projects, but these particular printers are a problem for us given the die experience that we've
Absolutely,
had.
right.
Okay. Please get better printers. Very good. Members, any questions? Hearing and seeing none.
I have a
Yes,
couple.
Mr. Kretz.
How much thought are we giving to the more ideal of having ratepayers pay their bills online than trying to move them away from, the paper and other environmental questions like, are we now using 100% post-consumer recycled paper on our bills, et cetera? How much have we looked at all those?
Absolutely. Actually, right now, in addition to the printing, they do online bill payments as well. It's a combination of the two. So, but in the future, we do have an RFI going out to look at printing that can be done either outside of the city, outside of DWP, or even more pushing to like online billing. Many organizations do that. But the paper, the paper, the ink, all the components, they have to be tested, and they have to be tested with this particular printer. So, unfortunately, this particular ink works with this particular printer, and only that, as you mentioned, Councilman.
So are we doing things to try and incentivize online bill payment? Because presumably it would be an environmental positive, and we would save money and on and on. So
Absolutely, yeah.
what are we doing to incentivize it?
Well, I think what we're going to be doing is, as we move forward, we're going out with an RFI to look at, more like online bill payments where we don't have to print, we don't have to use ink. Hopefully, like in 2018, there might be a situation where we won't be printing any longer as well. So, not using paper or ink, or even all the additional features involved in printing. After printing, there's insertion and RPC, and there's many aspects beyond printing as well. We'll eliminate many of those aspects as well.
Mr. Koretz, the next meeting that we have on the 19th, we're going to be entertaining 3 different motions all around billing. So I would love to make sure that we continue the conversation, because I, like you, would like to see more folks pay online, as well as on the My 311 LA app, which is another place where you can pay your DWP bill. Mr. Blumenfield.
Yeah, it's just along those lines as an anecdotal thing. I do my billing through my bank online, and on my phone bill and on several other bills, something pops up, says, do you want to have e-bills? And I click yes, and now I get those bills. I just click on them from my bank statement.
Right.
Nothing like that happens with it. But I pay my LA DWP through my online banking, but it physically sends a check. But unlike Verizon and some of these other ones, if that were available, there'd be a lot of people like me who would just click that option.
Right.
Yeah, the view bill function, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So you bill, mine sometimes says due, but you can also hit the view and see what your bill is. So, when we come back in 2 weeks and talk about billing, we should certainly sort of explore that, because I think you're right to underscore Mr. Koretz's point and Mr. Blumenfield's. We need to figure out how to be more efficient and more electronic in our bill pay. Very good. So the recommendation is to approve this request for authority to execute this amendment to the contract, and that is out unanimously. Item number 5.
Item number 5, Mr. Chair, DWP and City Attorney reports and ordinance relative to the settlement of eminent domain litigation with Caltrans for highway easements located in the city of Baldwin Park. We have a report from DWP as well as City Attorney. Now, you may convene in a closed session if need be, because it's a property transaction, but that depends on the questions that are brought.
Very good. And is somebody here from the City Attorney's Office? Yes. Very good. Will you just let us know, be mindful as to whether we need to go into closed session depending on the questions, if you would do us that favor? Because I'm not an attorney, I just play one when I sit here. Very good. CAO.
Okay. Again, Robert Roth, CAO's office. This report recommends approval for this resolution that Number 1, authorizes a settlement agreement between the city and California Department of Transportation involving eminent domain litigation relating to land owned by LA, which is located in the city of Baldwin Park, California. It also authorizes an ordinance to be prepared by the city attorney to convey an approximately 517 square foot permanent easement and a 568 square foot temporary construction easement, excluding all water and water rights, located in the city of Baldwin Park for payment of $13,300. The value of that easement is based on an appraisal conducted by Caltrans and approved by DWP. DWP has determined that this proposed easement will not impact current or anticipated needs of the department, and the city attorney has approved the item as to form and legality. They've also prepared an ordinance, draft ordinance, which should be in your packages. Our office recommends approval.
Very good. Members, any questions? So we're selling here.
Very small amount of land.
Caltrans is
An
buying.
easement, though.
Very
Just
good.
an easement.
Okay, Mr. Kretz? Very good. Hearing and seeing no questions, the item is approved, and it's approved unanimously.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Mr. Legislative Analyst, that concludes our business.
That concludes your agenda.
Watch this. We're adjourned.